Hello, buenas tardes. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And first off, I just want to thank the Kennedy Center. This is my first formal experience with the Kennedy Center, and I am impressed through and through. They've been great in organizing and accommodating, and the installments and everything here is just very impressive. So we're very impressed and look forward to further opportunities. My name is Bryant Jensen. I'm a assistant professor of education in the McKay School here on campus. And I've studied children of Mexican immigrants for some time, and also children in Mexico, largely in communities where there's a lot of out-migration, immigration with an E instead of with an I. And so that led me to meet one of the most prolific scholars, a demographer and sociologist in Mexico, Silvia. She is a tremendous person. She and I met through a binational sort of research project that brought together scholars from both countries to understand basically how the migration sort of phenomenon of not only folks of Mexican origins coming to Mexico, but also there's been a lot of return migration to Mexico, how we can understand that phenomenon as a means to improve social and economic development, especially in Mexico. A lot of the migration, as Silvia will talk about, comes from rural settings, and there remain important needs for all sorts of developments. And she and I have looked together at educational developments in those settings, the quality of teaching and learning in primary and secondary schools. Silvia's interests are broad, and she has expertise that is very impressive. She was trained as a sociologist at Brown University. She earned her PhD there. And a few years later was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Any of you who know that center, it has great history. It's where Thomas Kuhn wrote his book on scientific revolutions, and Silvia was there among those great intellectual giants, and she is also a great intellectual giant. So we are very pleased to have her here. Why Mexico? 1 in 7 children in the U.S. who are in pre-K to 12 schools are Mexican American. 1 in 10 has a Mexican-born parent. Mexico, in many ways, will continue to shape our destiny, not only in public schools, but in other public and private sectors. And so it's a timely issue. While many argue that we are in a post-immigrant era, you know, immigration from Mexico has decreased greatly since the Great Recession of 2008. We are in no way in a post-immigrant America. Mexican origin families and children will continue to be a part and will shape our society and political parties for years to come. So thank you, Silvia. Let's welcome her with a warm applause.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Corey. I really feel welcome to this university. It's my first time in Utah. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to present here and share some of the recent work in Mexico-U.S. migration that I myself have been doing along with a larger research group. As Brian said, I'm also very impressed with the well-organized and all the infrastructure around the Kennedy Center. Thank you very much, Corey, for facilitating this presentation and for the invitation. And again, thank you to Brian, who I'm very pleased to collaborate. Not in this case, we're working together, as Brian mentioned, on research looking at the binational perspectives of international migration and education. The main goal, well, after I got the invitation and I started thinking, well, what about Mexico-U.S. migration I would like to present here? I decided to focus this presentation on the Mexican perspective as a sending country, on the implications of the international migration for Mexico in terms of the impact it has on sending communities, on families of origin, and how this new emerging pattern that Brian mentioned is creating new challenges and new needs and new vulnerabilities, and how the Mexican government, the Mexican society should be thinking on responding to these new challenges and to the new scenarios that are emerging. In fact, all these that I'm presenting at the same time as all these processes that I'm going to present in a few moments are going on, at the federal government, there are a lot of other discussions coming on. In Mexico, there's being discussed a change in the law that regulates out-migration and development. There's a discussion on we're going to have for the first time a special program on migration. And there's a lot of discussion on immigration and transit migration in Mexico, which I won't have a lot of time, but if in the questions and in the Q&A part there, I would happily answer. And there's also a new migration law that's going to be implemented in the next year. So along with all these, there are a lot of institutional changes going on also in terms of how Mexico is dealing with its own migration. Okay. So this would be the outline of my presentation. I will present as a good demographer. I have some graphs and data. So I will start with some facts on the migration flows between Mexico and the US. I will focus on the emerging patterns and the new trends. And then when I was trying to think about which challenges are, I mean, there are a lot, but probably these 5 would be the most relevant ones in terms of the discussion. I won't be able to go through all of them, but at least I will try to mention most of them. Okay. So first of all, now one of the questions that we are trying to respond is whether we are moving toward a new pattern or to whether what's going on now with the Mexico-US migration is sort of a short-term effect that will change again once the economy keeps on recovering in the US. Just to make a little bit of story, migration from Mexico to the US, as you know, it's an old migration. It's more than a century. It's more than a century of Mexicans returning, leaving for the US and returning to Mexico. But there have been a lot of changes along the time. Until the 70s, it used to be a very stable flow. And it was a stable flow that was mainly men, most of them household heads, married with children, that engage in a pattern of circular migration that will come and go yearly, mainly from rural areas, and concentrated in certain regions in Mexico. So we would say that almost the 70s, that would be sort of the pattern in general. In the 70s, but especially later after in the late 80s and in the 90s, there was a large change and people start talking about the new profile of Mexico-US migration. It kept on being a labor migration, and as you would see in the graph, it concentrates on the population. Okay, well, it concentrates on the population in working ages between 15 and 64 years of age. And starting in the 90s, we also see a set of shifts and changes in the way Mexicans were moving that led to a larger increase in the population the population of Mexicans living in the US, to that peak of 12 million, where it's still around 12 million. And other changes, well, these changes respond first to longer stays. This circular pattern was broken, so it became more a permanent migration. Even though it was probably started by men moving, at the end, when it was more difficult to return, they start bringing their families to the US, and they start settling down and having children here in the US. So all those changes sort of permeated the discussion around Mexico-US migration in the 90s and in the 2000s. For Mexico, in the 2000s, along that decade, it meant that 10% of Mexicans would be living in the US. And if we think about the working age population, that meant 18% of the working age population, Mexican working age population, would be in the US. So that's sort of the first question. What does it mean to have 18% of your working age population living in another country? And how do you deal it as a challenge in terms of the development for a country? And the other change that was important, and I'm going to show a little bit some maps, is that from being a very regionally concentrated phenomena, it started to spread all around the country. So now you would have migrants from new states in Mexico that were not engaged in migration before. What does it mean in terms of the implications? Well, what does it mean? And I'll show this one a little bit. What does it mean in terms of the implications or what we need to think about of that period of an increase in migration? Migration played a role as a valve escape for the Mexican economy. This was the time where the high fertility rates in the 70s were resulting in a high pressure on the labor market. We have a lot of young people entering the labor market, so there was a lot of pressure on the labor market. Migration served as an escape valve. There was a lot of interest on remittances and how remittances may foster local development. So in the meantime, there was a crisis economic crisis in Mexico that decreased a lot of public investment in infrastructure, and in communities that have a large migration exposure, immigrants invested a lot on infrastructure, sort of even replacing a little bit public investment. And there was a lot of excitement around remittances and what would remittances do in terms of fostering local development. But at the same time, we started looking at other non-economic effects of migration. For example, we started looking at the effects of family separation, because when migration lost this circularity, so parents would be, fathers especially, but also parents, mothers, and sometimes would be away for longer periods from their children. And there were other issues that were related to emotional costs, for example, and mental health that now we know. So there was a lot of debate about the benefits and consequences of out-migration during the 90s and the last decade, but I think that this enthusiasm around remittances sort of make us overlook all other aspects on international migration. So now we're looking at what maybe, and as I put it as a question, maybe a new pattern. The 2000 census of both countries, but especially the 2000 census in Mexico, gave us a new scenario of international migration. The changes are related, as Brian mentioned, to the economic situation in the US, but also to the restrictive policies and deportations. And also it responds to a deceleration on the growth of the Mexican population in the US. That it has stagnated, as I mentioned, around 12 million. This change in the migration pattern reflects first in a fall in annual arrivals. And what I'm showing in this graph is an estimate that Jeff Passell did on annual entries to Mexico based on US on the CPS, the Current Population Survey. And as you can see here, I don't know which one is the pointer. The very top, sorry, thank you. So here, what you can see is that in 2000, there was the highest number of entries. You have 760,000 entries. In 2005, it reached again another peak, but then it started slowing down even before the economic crisis. So there is some evidence that even before the economic crisis, the Mexican population was not growing as fast as it has grown before. But it's clear that once the economic crisis started here in the US, there was a large decrease, and it sort of stabilized around 150,000 annual entries, and it's probably around there still now. So the first grand change for Mexico is the decrease of out-migration, and I will talk a little bit about that later. What does that mean in terms of, if we look at it regionally? As I mentioned, migration used to be a very regional focused event in Mexico. So this would be like the traditional region of migration in the center western part of Mexico. And this would be the ones that are red and sort of orange are the areas in Mexico with the highest prevalence of migration. That means with the highest number of out-migrants coming to the US. And this is the map for 2000. When we look at 2010, you can clearly see how we lose the oranges and reds. So it's showing that this decrease in out-migration, it happened also all around the country. The other change for us that is meaningful is the increase, and the other also return, okay, yeah. The other great change has to do with return migration. So we are now saying that Mexico is close to a net zero migration, which means that the number of people arriving is sort of the same as the number of people leaving the US. So we are looking at something that we didn't have before, and it's an increase in the number of return migrants that we didn't have before, I mean, during the 90s and the 2000s. So this would be, what I'm showing in this graph is the estimate of the number of return migrants in a 5-year period. And as you will see, like in the 2000 census, it was around 267,000, and then it increased to close to 1 million by the year 2010. So that's a large change in terms of having population returning to Mexico. Why are people returning? As we mentioned, some of the causes had to do with economics. Some others had to do to the increase of deportations. And here we have two different processes. At the same time, while the American migration policy became more restrictive and there was more border enforcement, the number of detentions at the border decreased. And that is the large gray bar that you have in the graph. But in parallel, the last years of last decade, we see a large increase of what we call forced removal, not deportations that happen at the workplace or people that were detained for minor or non-minor felonies and were also deported to Mexico. However, there's also another component that has to do with return migration that is not deportation and is not for forced removal, but that is maybe related to families moving all together. And again, when we look at it regionally, and this is the same map again, but now for return migration. So we do have return migration in 2000, as you see the red and orange is concentrated in the regional, in the traditional migration areas, and it's lower all around the country. When you look at 2010, you have return migration all over the country, and especially important in the border. So this is a new phenomenon, even if you think at the local level. No? So we have Mexicans who had lived in the US probably 10, 15 years, are returning to Mexico, to the border. They are not necessarily returning to their communities of origin. A large proportion of them are returning to the communities of origin, but some others are settling in cities or in the border, which are regions totally new for them. Many of them moved to the US when they were very young, so they have lost contact, so they don't know anything about the labor market, how it works, networks, etc. So it's really a policy concern how to facilitate the integration of these return migrants in Mexico. And the other data I wanted to show you about people moving into Mexico is that we have also about 700,000 US-born population moving to Mexico. So most of them, about 500,000, is very young population. It's under 15 years of age. So we assume that it's the children of, no, we don't assume. We know that it's the children of Mexican migrants that are returning. And I think when we try to think about binational perspectives, they're American citizens. In some field work that has been conducted, they expect to return to the US once they turn 18, and they can move without their parents' permission. But they have all these set of problems reincorporating because they are arriving to Mexico for the first time, incorporating to the Mexican institutions such as the school. So this is an issue that, as Brian has said, and we have done it before, that needs a binational look about all these processes. Okay. The other change that happened has to do with remittances. As I mentioned before, during the 90s and all along the first decade of this century, there has been a lot of enthusiasm around remittances and the importance of remittances for local development. And this has been something that federal governments and local governments have said, but it's also fostered by international organizations such as the IDB, the International Development Bank. So what we found also is that during the crisis, while the remittances kept on increasing all around the last decade of last century and this decade, all the way until 2007 and 2008. Then there was a large decrease in the number of remittances arriving to Mexico. Now here, this is what I'm showing in this graph is the aggregate data. When we look at the families, what we found is that also a lot of families that were receiving remittances and where remittances was the main source of income lost this source of income during the economic crisis, according to the 2010 census. So again, I'm showing it geographically. If you look in 2000, again in red and orange, you have the municipalities where many of the households, as many as half of the households, lived or received remittances. And the change is not as drastic as a change in terms of return migration and out migration, but still there's some change and some decrease in the number of households receiving remittances along the time. Now, in this period, and especially in certain areas, in what we call the priority attention areas, we have the largest prevalence of households living in poverty. That's where we see the most vulnerability resulting from this decrease on migration, on remittances. Okay. So this sort of compounds what's going on in terms of the mobility between Mexico and in the US. Whether it is a new pattern or not, there's a lot of uncertainty on what would happen in the future. There was certainly certain slowdown in terms of the way migration was increasing in between 2002 and 2007. So we don't expect to find or to see the same high levels of out-migration that we saw in the prior decades. As I mentioned before, there's less demographic pressure in the local labor markets. But so that's something that we will see in the future. Still, what's going on now sort of create, as I mentioned, new challenges. And there's sort of the question of what we can expect from this new migration scenario. On remittances, this enthusiasm, so it has been almost 10 years where a lot of the local policies and federal policies have been focused on trying to direct the use of remittances for infrastructure and for productive projects in order to foster local development. So after 20 years of that policies that have been implemented at the local and at the federal level, the evidence is sort of inconclusive in terms of to what extent remittances can actually be a way of fostering local development. And now there are reviews being done not only in Mexico, but in other studies or other scholars working on migration in other places of the world that are sort of posing this question. So the evidence so far is inconclusive. Sometimes, yeah, migration is very important for local development. Sometimes it drains resources. Sometimes for communities where half of the working age population is in the US, it does not mean an improvement in the situation or better expectations of social mobility for households in the long run. There is no clear evidence that it reduces poverty at the family level. There is no clear evidence that a household receiving remittances, in houses receiving remittances, children will do better in school. In some cases they do, in some cases they don't. So I think that we are starting losing the enthusiasm around remittances. And I think that sort of forces to rethink the migration development link. And then if you combine these ideas with the new migration scenario, so we will say, well, migration is no longer, okay, so here is what I was mentioning, sort of how international migration was being seen as a way to foster local economic development, infrastructure, health, education, and this is now what we don't see any conclusive. Some cases, so in some studies you find positive evidence, in some other studies you find negative evidence. It's not very clear. Okay, so if you think of the new migration scenario that I have just depicted, and what it means in terms of the migration and development link, and what challenges we may be facing in the short run or the medium term. First, migration as out-migration has decreased, we cannot think of migration in Mexico as an escape valve. What does that mean? In the first place, even though demographic pressure has decreased and working age population is not growing as fast as it used to grow a decade ago, there is still a very important growth in terms of the number of young people entering the labor market every year. So for those who migration was an option, for most of them it's no longer an option. So that will create local pressure on the labor markets due to the drop in out-migration. What we would expect, probably an increase of internal migration to cities, and probably what has happened in most of Latin America, other responses as an increase in the informal sector. So this is all happening in a context where unemployment is not high in Mexico, but the informal sector is very large. It's about 40% of the working age of the working population. And we have found an increase in terms of the rotation in labor, less stability in labor, and in terms of the people working under very precarious conditions. Second, so we need to face the issue of the vulnerability of households depending on remittances, especially on those rural areas or those municipalities that have very high levels of poverty. So this sort of overlaps with the question of social policy. Now the issue is whether if you create specific programs for households that used to receive remittances, for example, in order to compensate for the decrease in their income, you have to create similar programs for those households that are not related to migration. You cannot sort of create this special treatment and separation. So it has to be framed within a larger concept of the social policies in Mexico. And as I mentioned, there has been a growing research on other non-economic consequences of international migration for migrants and their families, such as the effects of family separation. And well, that's something that we have to consider when there's a lot of research being done in Mexico, being done in the US about children that stay here and their parents are deported and the impact of family separation. But when we look at the Mexican data, from the Mexican data perspective, and this table shows how family structure is affected by international migration. So for example, if you look at the small red square of households receiving remittances, that would be mainly following this pattern of one or both parents abroad and the children staying behind, and the mother and the grandparents in charge of the kids. So you have that only 40% of them live with both of their parents. So for households, children living in households that receive remittances, 60% are not living with one of their parents, and if you look at the data, 16% are living with neither of their parents. And that does have an impact in terms of the social and emotional well-being of the children. And this is the case for households receiving remittances. That was probably where the data is most different in terms of the absence of the one or both parents. But this pattern of absence of the separation from the parents repeats for children who are returned migrants themselves, or for children who were born in the US and have moved to Mexico in the last 5 years. That, for example, even though when we look at it at national level, it's not a very high percentage, you may find municipalities where it's like close to 20% of the households that have children returning, or American-born children that are arriving for the first time to these communities. And it sort of poses a set of challenges, administrative procedures of how to integrate them to school, challenges in terms of how the educational system responds to the needs of these children. And there have been some federal and state responses. This would be a specific case of what's been done. Of course, there are some programs for return migrants. For example, for children, there have been some federal responses in terms of facilitating administrative procedures for enrollment, but we are lagging behind in terms of how teachers should be sensitized and should be trained in order to deal with classrooms when you have children that have never been taught in Spanish before. So I think, to summarize, okay, well, I also in my first slide, I also mentioned that there are other challenges related, for example, to in-transit migration, or to the case of Mexico as a country of destination, as immigration to Mexico from other countries has also increased. There are also other challenges as the prevailing risks while crossing to the US, and of course the situation of Mexicans in the US, which is also an issue of public policies for the Mexican government. I think this sort of summarizes what's going on. It sort of summarizes the trends. It sort of summarizes what we think will be the consequences of this new migration scenario. As I mentioned before, in Mexico we're now we are revising the laws, defining new programs for migrants, and there are some local and federal responses. But I think that we still need to move towards a more cohesive and coherent response to challenges and to the opportunities, because I don't think there are only challenges, there are also opportunities that derive from this international migration scenario at the family and at the community level. And that will be all. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. We've got about 15 minutes, so I encourage you to come up to the microphone here at the front, and we'll have plenty of time to engage in a little more discussion about in-migration, out-migration, and these interesting demographic issues in Mexico.
Hi, I'm Tim Strickland, international relations major. What effect has narco-terrorism and narco-trafficking had on the immigration and out-migration of Mexico?
Okay. So should I answer one? Okay. Yeah. So I would talk about the link between international migration and violence in Mexico in general. No? So there are several things to consider. First, we know that in regions with with a lot of violence, that overlap with some of the traditional regions of migration, sort of Michoacán and Jalisco, that migration is an option for many of those as a way to escape from violence. And there's either migration to the states that are not living the same violent situation, such as some states in the center, but when there are migration networks to the US. So that's a new pattern of migration that we had not considered before. It's not a migration that is that starts because of labor or economic reasons, but that start because people are fleeing from violent situations. And they rely a lot on networks. Second, and this is also happening in some of the cities in the north. So we do have, for example, middle class and families with more economic resources also migrating to border cities in Texas as a result of the violent situations, and so that's a new pattern of migration. Second, one of the problems that we have faced is that the roots of undocumented migrants are the same as the roots of drug dealers. So that has affected both Mexican migrants coming to the US, but also Central American migrants that are crossing Mexico to get to the US. And I think that's one of the largest challenges that we have now. I don't know if you have heard, well, there's in Mexico, there's in the news every day news about kidnaps and about how drug dealers have found the industry of migration a profitable one, no? So I think that's one of the challenges, and it has to be, again, within the strategy to face all the violent situation in certain parts of Mexico. And well, I think that would be. Does that answer to your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. No other question?
What's something a college student like me living in Utah could do to aid integration or to make the migration into the US or return migration? What's something I can do to contribute to make it a more positive thing?
Yeah. I think Brian can also answer that question. Well, there's of course, for example, one of the main issues that Brian has been working on, and he has more work, has to do to how children of immigrants from Mexico and from Central America in general are faring in schools in the U.S. No, so I do think that in terms of social mobility, in terms of having better conditions in the U.S., school is very important, and school is a means to sort of integrate and sort of facilitate that contact between the immigrant population and the local population. So that's something Brian has been working on with schools, with local schools here in Utah. I know that in Arizona they also have some cases. In California there are also some examples in New York State. You know? So that would be one approach if you think about this as the student population. And in terms of return migration, what we do know is that the more certainty families have while in the U.S., if they have to return, their return would happen also in better conditions. No? If you think the separation of an undocumented family where the father is deported, the mother stays here, it's very uncertain what's going on, it's very scared, the father does not have the links in Mexico and does not have the possibility of coming back. It's sort of all this scenario of uncertainty around families and around children, which does not facilitate also the way we deal with return migration, for example. No?
So you talked a lot about the problems that they have reintegrating immigrants who come back to Mexico? Are there any policies that like the Mexican government has instituted? Like, could you describe the policies that they've instituted to help with that reintegration into the communities?
There are policies which are not new. There are some of the programs that were implemented probably 10 years ago, but I think they're not very effective. For example, there's one of the largest programs is a program to help return migrants to integrate into the Mexican labor market, so they get $100 for starting a new business. No? So it really sounds like there's no way you can, no? Or they get $150 to move to their communities of origin, and then the $100 to start a business. So I think in terms of ideas, they're very good, because that's on labor. And then you have similar programs, for example, in dwelling, facilitating credit access to buy a dwelling for those returned migrants. And then you have some programs in education, such as this one. The Mexican educational system is very bureaucratic, not that. So they are trying to facilitate all the administrative procedure for returned children or American-born children that are coming to the U.S. to enter the school. I still think that many of them, the problem is that some of them are designed at the federal level, but once you go at the local level, for example, in terms of school, and you go to principals, and the principals say like, no, but these children, they don't speak Spanish, they don't know anything about Spanish history, how are we expected to integrate them into the school? So there's like this lack of communication on what's going on at the federal level and what's going on at the local level, and I think there are not enough resources that are being separated for these programs for returned migrants. And states also have some programs of their own. So you have the federal government programs, and then you have state programs. But for example, in some states, as the north, as I showed, there's a lot of return migration to the north, which is new. So states in the north do not have any provision or programs for return migrants, because they were only used to having to give attention in terms of humanitarian terms for return migrants. So they have albergues. How do you say albergues in English? Albergues, hostels for migrants, for them to be there temporary, but they are not ready to face the situation of having return migrants that are going to stay there. No? So this is also a lack of a difference between how local, at the local level, return migration was thought, and what's going on now according to what we are finding in the data. No?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So you mentioned that a lot of U.S. born citizens migrate to Mexico, and according to current immigration laws, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Article 32 states that according to their, foreigners are admitted to Mexico according to their possibilities of contributing to national progress. So what about those who, can you explain that law a little bit more, and how does that affect the U.S. born citizens who want to move to Mexico?
Yeah. So I didn't bring the data, but as I mentioned, of these 700,000, about 500,000 are minors. They are under 18, under 15, in fact. And most of them are born, one of their parents is Mexican. So they are dual citizens. No? In the 90s, Mexico changed the legislation so that it gave an option of having dual citizenship. So they are Mexicans also by law. So they are supposedly they should have the right to have the same access to services as any Mexican. The problem again, and it's very interesting, because when you go to some states, to some rural areas, and you ask the people, what do you need if I can help? They would say like, oh, please help me get the birth certificate for my child, because I cannot prove that he's my child, and I cannot prove that I'm Mexican, and then he will get the Mexican nationality, right? So that's part of the administrative procedures that I think we can do something to make it easier for them. But they should be getting all the same services, the same right for social programs, and they are not getting it because they don't have a way to show that they are actually dual nationals, dual citizens.
Well, thank you for for the lecture. It's been really interesting. I was hoping that, well, there's a lot of debate today on the, and it's been on the impact of NAFTA on Mexican, economic and social perspective. And I was hoping if you could expand on that, and also just in the context of the current immigration system, how is, just having enforcement only kind of policy, is that really effective in deterring migration and entering the U.S. and from Mexico? Does that make sense? Thank you.
Yeah, so when the NAFTA agreement was signed, there was also a lot of expectations in terms of its possible impact of migration, no? The Mexican president back then said that this way we will start exporting tomatoes, not people, no? So there was a lot of expectation around how NAFTA would create better opportunities in rural areas, and that would sort of retain people in their regions, in their regions of origin. But actually what happened along with NAFTA, what happened in general with the agricultural policy in Mexico, that it turned more into, instead of fostering production, turned a lot to subsidies, to a welfare policy that was cash transfers, direct cash transfers, but not necessarily larger productive projects. So what we can see, and I can give you also bibliography on this, is that in fact the rural outmigration continued. That there was large crisis on the rural area in certain parts of the country. Those that were able to link to the U.S., such as some of the northern states, would do better. But for example, the poorest states in the south, they would not able to link into this idea of NAFTA, so they would do worse. So yeah, in fact, if you think about it, yeah, NAFTA didn't have an impact in terms of decreasing migration. No? In fact, if you look at the timing, at the same time that NAFTA was implemented, you find the largest increases in the number of out-migrants to the Mexican out-migrants to the U.S. And in terms of enforcement and how enforcement deters migration, so with this change of the scenario, there has been a lot of debate whether this decrease in the number of arrivals every year responds to the restrictive policy or responds to other factors such as the economic factors. And in Mexico, the former Mexican president said, like, well, no, people are living less because now they have better options here in Mexico. No? So you have like 3 different possible explanations. I think that if you sort of look at how the debate among scholars is going, the argument would go more in terms of the economic impact, the impact of the flows in the U.S. economy on international migration than the other effects, because at the end, the need for labor is still there. As I mentioned, probably less pressure than before, but it's still there. And as long as the need for labor in the U.S. is there will be this tension, I suppose. No? And as I mentioned before, so we may expect again to have, and in fact we have seen in the most recent data, a little bit of increase in the number of migrants coming to the U.S. again. Not as high as before, it's very slow. The data says like, well, if it was 150,000 in 2010, probably it increased to 170,000, no? But it's still there. But I think in terms of policies, what would be, again, from the perspective of country of origin, would be to find a way to have an order management of flows that allows, probably circularity will not be gained because circularity was also related to a migration focused on agricultural sector, and now labor is more focused on construction and on services. So probably we will not gain that circularity that used to be, but it would facilitate, for example, this mobility of families back and forward depending on their interest, and it would create safer conditions also for crossing.
All right, I think that's our time. On behalf of the Kennedy Center, thank you very much.
No, thanks to you.